Okay everyone, so in this lecture video what we're going to be focusing on now is the chemical reaction processes that happen during photosynthesis. So last time we talked a little bit about the two different kinds of reactions that happen in the process of photosynthesis. The light-dependent reactions that require light and will actually absorb the energy that we then use in the light-independent reactions to help us build those more complicated sugars. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is think about why do we have so many different membranes inside of our chloroplasts? So again, each of these membranes are going to contain the different enzymes that are necessary to carry out the parts of the reactions that we need to take the high energy electrons and convert them into a form that's usable, right? Taking that light energy into a form or a chemically stored form of energy that we as organisms can utilize. So these membranes are key in capturing that light in our thylakoid inside of our chloroplast. And so thus we have lots of those. Plus it's the idea too that these organisms, they contain photosynthetic plastids, acquired those from other creatures, right? So we have this double membrane that occurred because in the process of taking that particular cell, like millions of years ago, into the cell, actually enveloped it. So we had our cell here, right? We enveloped it with the membrane. So now we've got the cell membrane that was of the previous prokaryote plus the membrane of our eukaryotic cell. So we have a double membrane there. Okay. All right. So we're going to start talking about the light-dependent reactions. So in these reactions, the light-dependent reactions are the ones that take the energy from the sun and convert it into a usable form, right, into ATP. So what we're doing is we're taking water, right, breaking it down, using the hydrogen ions, releasing oxygen as a byproduct to convert ADP, so adenosine diphosphate, to ATP and NADP plus, again, the electron carrier molecule, into NADPH. So the light-dependent reactions are going to encompass a lot of the steps that occur directly with the sunlight. So these occur again in the thylakoids inside of the chloroplast. So thylakoids contain a cluster of chlorophyll and proteins known as photosystems. So today we're going to be talking about our two major photosystems, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. And so each of these photosystems have the capability of absorbing sunlight to generate high energy electrons. So these electrons can then get passed down in an electron transport chain, very similar to what we saw in cellular respiration, to carry this energy from the sun. Right? And again, this is all embedded inside of the thylakoid membrane, inside of the chloroplast. So photosystem 2 is where we're going to start, and it sounds counterintuitive that we're going to start with photosystem 2 right, in the process. The reason why we call it photosystem 2 and we start there is that photosystem 2 in the discovery process of this particular reaction was the system that was discovered second, even though it occurs first in our series of reactions. Okay. So when we describe it, we still call it photosystem 2, so we start there. So light energy is going to be absorbed by the different pigments that are contained within photosystem 2. And so what will happen is we excite those pigments, excite various parts of the molecule, the electrons in those molecules, and those can get then passed down through a series of different electron carriers through an electron transport chain, or an ETC. So the series of electron carriers are going to shuttle this down for us to generate ATP. So photosystem 1 and 2's reactions and the light-dependent reactions do produce ATP. However, that ATP is not ATP that's usually utilized for, like, say, carrying out other cellular functions. It's utilized then to make sugars. So in photosystem 2, right, it's going to provide these new electrons that are necessary for, or provide the high energy electrons. So what we're going to do is we're going to take two water molecules, break them down so we have our 4 hydrogen ions, and then we can generate an O2, right? Because again, oxygen likes to be with itself. So to generate that O2 gas. So by splitting it up, we have now an excess number of hydrogen ions, right? And a place for these electrons to essentially transmit their energy to. So as we go through the different processes, these two electrons are going to replace these. So 2 electrons replace the high energy electrons that have been lost as part of the electron transport chain. So then oxygen is released as part of a byproduct, and these hydrogen ions are released into the thylakoid. Okay, so they're inside of this thylakoid area. Okay. So what's going to happen is as the electron carriers transport this energy via these electrons, what they're going to do is they're going to start funneling hydrogen ions from the stroma, the space out here, into the thylakoid space in here. So we're going to start seeing a gradient of hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid space. And we're going to use this gradient to help funnel what we're going to do later. So again, this is active transport. We're using energy from these electrons to move hydrogen against the gradient. So it's requiring energy for that to happen. So once we've reached the end of our electron photosystem 2, right? So we've used electrons to move hydrogen and ions into our thylakoid space. Now we're going to go to photosystem 1. So again, the same electrons are getting carried on that were excited by the light initially. So once we get to photosystem 2, here photosystem 2 is going to pick up energy just like photosystem 1 did. So as these electrons have moved through and we've caused the change in these particular proteins to pump hydrogens into the thylakoid space, electrons now don't contain as much energy, because remember, energy is lost because it's used and converted into a different form. So here we're going to have to re-excite or re-energize those electrons. So when we hit photosystem 1, again, we're absorbing another thing of light to excite this particular set of electrons. So at the end of our electron transport chain, again, a very short one, we've converted NADP plus into NADPH, and we picked up these hydrogen electrons and these ions on the surface of the thylakoid membrane. So we've got these going through the thylakoid space. So now that we've accumulated an excess of hydrogen ions inside of our thylakoid space, right, we can start using those hydrogen ions to do work. So essentially we can use that gradient to make ATP. So the buildup of these hydrogen ions makes the stroma negatively charged relative to the rest of the space. So because the charges are negative versus positive, and because we have an excess of hydrogen ions versus an area that does not have hydrogen ions, that's going to create a gradient that we can take advantage of and make work happen for. So this gradient, being the difference of the hydrogen ions here and the concentration outside the membrane, is going to provide the energy to make ATP, using this particular enzyme known as ATP synthase. So ATP synthase as a enzyme, right, is essentially going to spin around and it's going to force phosphates onto ADP to make ATP. So again, as we do that, we're using the energy that's stored in the gradient, right, since we pumped all of these hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space, taking that energy and then using it to convert ADP into ATP. And so now that we have ATP, we can use that because we know that ATP is a molecule that can transmit energy inside of a cell relatively easily. Okay. So powered by this gradient, ATP synthase is going to be forced to rotate, and then as it rotates, it adds that phosphate group. So we call this process chemiosmosis, right? Again, we're using a variation in our pressure gradient to force electrons to move these hydrogen ions in. So since now we have a gradient, right, where we have fewer hydrogen ions in the stroma versus in the thylakoid space, those hydrogen ions are going to want to move through the channel that is going to allow them to go through. Again, these won't go through the membrane because hydrogen ions are charged, and charged things generally don't move through a membrane very easily, so they require a protein to do that. That protein, ATP synthase, will then take advantage of that gradient, allow us to produce ATP, which we would then use in our light independent reactions. So just a brief summary of what's going on. So again, we have light energy that's coming in from photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 is taking hydrogen, is getting hydrogen ions from splitting water. So we'll use 2 of our water molecules to split this so that we get oxygen gas as one of our byproducts. Again, we know that that's a product of photosynthesis, so that ends up getting emitted out into the environment. And then taking these hydrogen ions we produced, right, by creating this gradient, we can start pumping these hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space. So again, photosystem 2 is going to take those high energy electrons to split water and pump some hydrogen in. Then we'll re-excite those electrons using light again in photosystem 1. And photosystem 1 will again transmit those electrons across the photosystem, and in the process continue to move hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space, which then ATP synthase can use to generate ATP from ADP in order to run our light independent reactions. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop there with this. Again, just to review the light dependent reactions, the big takeaways here are that we've got photosystem 2 goes to photosystem 1, and that in photosystem 2, we're splitting water to get our hydrogen ions and oxygen gas. We're using these hydrogen ions to generate a concentration gradient, and then taking advantage of that gradient, we can use ATP synthase to produce ATP necessary for our light independent reactions. So again, light dependent reactions require light. We use at least 2 photons of light to excite our electrons, and that in this process, we're generating NADPH, which we need for the light independent reactions, as well as ATP, which is again a form of energy that we need to generate our more complicated carbon-based molecules to produce things like glucose. Okay. All right, so if you have questions, let me know.